In this lecture, we're looking at Calvin and his context in the early Reformed Church. And the reason for this lecture is because so often what we believe Calvin is stepping into is often not what he was actually stepping into. Meaning, when I was a student and I was first coming across this period, I had this somewhat intuitive sense that when Calvin comes on the scene in Geneva, because Zwingli had died in 1531, there was this sort of natural belief that what was happening in Switzerland at the time was that Calvin was coming to a blank canvas, you might say. He was coming to at least an unformed, unfashioned church with not a lot of preconditioned answers or perspectives on things. I had, in other words, a rather naive view, a rookie view, it's fine, but a naive view that, again, the only way to understand the Reformation is to read Luther onto everyone else. And so I believe that Calvin was the Luther of the Swiss regions, and so what he came to do was to affect just about everything throughout those regions. Well, I was quickly disabused of that. As I dug a little bit deeper, I began to realize that Calvin wasn't stepping onto a blank canvas. Rather, he was stepping into a situation that was enormously complex and varied, and in many ways, far more of a challenge than what Luther had to face in Wittenberg. Because what was already on the ground in the Swiss regions, in the areas and the cities that will become reformed over time, is a set of preconditioned impulses and instincts and theological positions that had been worked out on the crucible of Luther and Zwingli at the Marburg Colloquy. And so over the years, I've sort of dealt with this, where I realized that what's happening for a lot of us is we are not sure what Calvin is interacting with. And if we're not sure of the context, then we're not going to get the man right either. Well, don't worry, the answer is simple. There's really two things you have to get right in order to understand the early Reformed faith. One is the geography, and two is you have to understand the people that are on the ground. And if you get these two perspectives more or less in your minds, at least at an intuitive level, you don't have to know all of these details, but if you have sort of this intuitive understanding of the challenges Calvin faced and the challenges that the Reformed movement faced, then you'll at least be in a better position to appreciate or grasp or understand what it is he's doing in the context of Geneva. Okay, first of all, the geography. The Swiss regions is what we refer to this area as. Another name that is often used is that these are the Swiss cantons. More on that in a minute. But notice that we're not saying Switzerland. And that is because Switzerland does not yet exist. Rather, what you have is you have a republic of a variety of different groups and sub-factions within the Alpine regions that are more or less congealed and which work together whenever possible, but which do not form a united nation or a united front. They have no single ruler. In fact, in a manner of speaking, the Swiss regions look a lot more like Greek city-states in the ancient world. Each city runs itself. Each city creates its own laws. If you ever travel to Europe, in fact, if you go to Geneva or to Zurich or any of the other smaller cities that were touched by the Reformation, often you can go and find a plaque on some wall on some street that indicates that at some point in the 1520s or 30s, the Reformation was decided here for this city. So, for example, Zwingli in Zurich, his ministry is to convince the city leaders of the need for the Reformation in the city. He has no wider orbit, in other words. Similarly, Geneva, while somewhat independent, was nevertheless part of a wider spectrum within these Swiss regions. So what's going on here? Well, put simply, the evolution of the Swiss regions or the Swiss cantons into this old republic had occurred during the Middle Ages. And essentially what you have here are a number of folks that band together and work together. Sometimes there's 3, sometimes there's 5, etc. And this looks a bit like North America in the sense of you have little individual states, and sometimes within a region you'll have a key city, And at times, you have a key city that is almost a state unto itself. Now, this loose conglomeration of folks brought with it both advantages and challenges. There was this sort of rabid individualism of the individual areas. They wanted to work together, but they did not want to be told what to do very often. And often what you have is, for example, in the city of Geneva, you'll have folks who believe that only Genevans should decide what Geneva ought to do. Keep that in mind, by the way, when we get to Calvin being kicked out of Geneva. Likewise, the Reformation in Zurich, as Zwingli is preaching from the pulpit there in the main church, he is calling for reformation. He is browbeating so many of the politicians to wake up and understand that the scriptures are opposed to the Catholic faith. And in some respects, these reformations, in particular Zwingli's Reformation, is a real complex mixture of a political reformation as well as a theological one. Now again, this is before those two worlds are separated, so we don't have to see this as some new invention of the Reformed faith. But it does raise enormous complexity. Let me give you just one example. In the Second Disputation in Zurich, there arose a problem over the issue of conformity to the political order. Now, there had been a first disputation on whether or not the Bible was the only authority to be used for theology. And this is really something of the epitome of what I'm talking about. Here you have the city council, those who are elected from the city, sitting in judgment as Zwingli and ostensibly a Catholic priest, though he didn't show up, he figured that the decision was already made. But you have the political order sitting in judgment as the theological case for the Reformation is laid before them. Well, the first one went down well. The second one, though, did not, because the second disputation in Zurich was on the issue of icons and images. Should these statues and all of this art that is held over from the Catholic Church be left in the church, or should they be burned or destroyed or removed in some way? And Zwingli was adamant on this, that these things are repugnant, that they break the commandment against graven images. Well, famously, the city council realized that simply destroying the art of the church, sort of having one of these crazy bonfires where everything gets tossed in, it could breed vandalism. It could breed disorder. And so they agreed with Zwingli, but they cautioned a slower, more deliberate process of the removal of superstitions from the worship. Two disputations, two outcomes. One is supported by the political arm, the other is not. Again, that's just a microcosm of the complexity here within these cities and within the political regimes of the Swiss regions. Now, I think one other myth we have to disabuse ourselves of is so often when we hear Switzerland, when we hear Swiss, we think of snow, vacations, Swiss cheese, and chocolate. And we also think of pacifism. It is just part of our world that the Swiss regions do not go to war. Well, the origins of this actually come from the 16th century. Right about 1515, there was enacted policies throughout the Swiss regions that they would remain neutral on all sort of pan-national wars. However, don't see in this the modern understanding of the Swiss culture. You see, because in the Reformation times, the Swiss culture was more or less Sparta. I mean, these dudes were tough. The Alpine regions bred really tough individuals. And they bred really feisty individuals as well. The only potential rival for the claim of toughest reformational country, frankly, is Scotland. But that's mostly due to the reputation of Knox as a firebrand who, when we first see him come on the scene, is carrying a double-edged sword. Some kind of Braveheart Highlander mix of a reformer running around ready to chop some heads off. Well, the Swiss regions as a whole, these were some bad dudes. Because even though the national sort of position, the position of the Republic as a whole, was that the Swiss regions would not go to war and would remain neutral, nevertheless, the market for Swiss mercenaries was almost insatiable. Young men would actually sell themselves as bands of soldiers, and at times they would fight the wars for various countries for them. They were tough and they were prone to fight, frankly. In fact, Zwingli, one of his first ministry opportunities, was he was a chaplain during some of these skirmishes and wars, and in fact was there for a great massacre of a number of Swiss sons, for which he actually wrote a poem. You can actually, by the way, go and still see this if you ever travel to Rome today. Everyone who goes to the Vatican loves to make fun of the weird guys in the sparkly colored, spangly outfits. You almost feel like they need to be doing jazz hands anytime they walk around the Vatican. Well, those of you who have been there might have picked up on the fact that they are the Swiss Guard. To this day, in fact, each of these guardsmen, wearing outfits that go back to the Reformation period, come from the Swiss regions. They are, in a manner of speaking, still the mercenaries for the Pope. And trust me, they are well trained. Don't mess with them. They are tall, they are big, they are Swiss rednecks, and they will take you out. Well, back to the Reformation. What goes on in the Swiss regions, though, is you have this very feisty, somewhat temperamental, idiosyncratic republic where some regions and some cities really don't want to be told what to do. They're very individualistic. Add to that the complexity of the fact that there are 2 or 3 languages spoken throughout the spectrum of the Swiss regions. If you follow your mind's eye up to Zurich, of course, the names Zurich and Zwingli, all these very Germanic-sounding names, well, that's on the German side of the Swiss regions. You travel down the Arc along the southern border, you will find Italian-speaking folks from time to time. But especially when you get to the far western side of the Swiss regions, you are now in the French-speaking Swiss cantons. Now, during the Reformation, everyone that's involved, Bullinger, Butzer, Calvin, others, all would converse in Latin. So I'm not saying that there was a language barrier, but I am saying that there was a cultural barrier. It didn't always rear its head, but from time to time it would. In fact, as I've mentioned in a previous lecture, Calvin in particular, and Farel for a time when he's in Geneva, will be marked as those silly Frenchmen who had come to Geneva to tell them what to do. And even though some of the leading families and some of the leading forces within Geneva are French, they're French-speaking, they identify themselves as Genevan and part of that region of the Swiss Alps. So take just a moment to look at this map. What's going to happen over the course of the Reformation is you have almost a triangulation, you might say, between Calvin down in Geneva, Butzer and others up in Strasbourg, and way out in the east, Bullinger and Zurich. And the 3 of these will not see eye to eye on everything. In fact, the story is in large part how these 3 men and others stitched together a cohesive perspective on things that allowed them to keep their differences and their diversity without compromising the fact that they are one in just about every other doctrine. Okay, one last bit on the geography. The Swiss regions technically are part of the Holy Roman Empire, but there was a de facto, you might say, almost unstated realization that nobody was going up into the Swiss regions to tell them what to do. Charles certainly could claim to be head of these cities or these regions, at least by and large. But he wasn't taking his troops up into those Alps, and if he was, well, he'd be meeting the Spartan-esque Swiss mercenary soldiers, and good luck with that. Okay, that's the geography. What about the people? Well, you'll recall that in our lecture on Luther and Marburg, I laid out the story of how Luther and Zwingli had gone at it over the subject of the Lord's Supper. And by and large, the Lord's Supper provides us a clue to understand what is going on in the Swiss regions. When you actually look at the folks that are involved in the Swiss regions themselves, you have a group that I've called, and I'm going to continue to call, a band of brothers. And they are Zwingli, though he is a brother who dies early in 1531. There's Wolfgang Musculus. He himself also dies in 1531 of the plague. But there are a number of others who actually live beyond this. Bullinger, Butzer, and Calvin we've already seen. There's also Capito, and, love this name, Oecolampadius. Oecolampadius is actually a very important figure. And there are some other minor figures which I won't go into. There is one, by the way, late-born apostle, you might say, to borrow from Paul, a man by the name of Peter Martyr. Peter Martyr is an important figure because he comes almost out of nowhere. He lived in Italy for a long period of time, and if you can believe it, there are some areas of Italy during the Reformation that are more hospitable to the Reformation ideas than just about anywhere else in 16th century Europe. Well, Peter Martyr lives for a long period of time, and then in the 1540s, very late, himself very old, he's not a second-generation reformer, he's just old when he converts. At this point, Peter Martyr flees, and he spends the rest of his life gallivanting around. He teaches in Strasbourg, in Zurich. He goes up to Oxford and consults with Cranmer on the prayer book, and then he's back down to the Swiss Reformed regions, where he's helping fashion and shape so much of the theological vision of what would come after the death of the first generation of the Reformed voices. And Peter Martyr is vitally important. He helps Calvin, for example, we know now, clarify a couple of his points on the sacraments. They exchange a few letters. Calvin asks a few questions. Peter Martyr gives an answer back. And lo and behold, it shows up in the Institutes. Oh, and by the way, given the fact that Peter Martyr is a pretty devout Reformed figure, really instrumental in shaping Reformed theology, and the fact that Butzer is himself the discipler of Calvin, and the fact that both these men go to Oxford and to Cambridge by the invitation of Thomas Cranmer to help shape the Anglican Church, should, I hope, destroy the idea in your minds that the Anglican Church is not really Protestant. Not only is it Protestant, but Cranmer is inviting the really serious Protestants in the Reformed tradition up to help shape his prayer book and the foundation of the Anglican Church. So this is the complexity. These are the people that are involved. Now, what does this have to do with understanding where Calvin is coming from? Well, after 1531, two things emerge. First of all, those who are loyal to Zwingli, those who are within his orbit, in particular Bullinger, who is the successor to Zwingli in the city of Zurich. And not just the successor, he actually becomes the antistes. The antistes was something of a rank, an honorific at first, but then it becomes an official rank that functions somewhere between a bishop and a stated clerk of a presbytery. He's not as high as a bishop in this day and age, but he's also not simply the administrator of the Reformed Church in Switzerland. Rather, he is the first chair. He's the head man. Well, Bullinger is that. Well, here's how you read the spectrum. Anyone who is acquainted or leaning towards the Zurich Zwinglian side is going to have intuitions towards being, frankly, pretty hostile to anything Lutheran or coming out of Wittenberg. The relationship, in other words, between Zurich and Wittenberg is forever a Cold War. And so Bullinger and others really tread a Zwinglian line. Now, let me clarify. This isn't so much a doctrinal position as it is a relational position. They are still licking their wounds due to the harsh treatment that Luther gave them. On the other side of the spectrum, though, within the Reformed tradition, are those who may be converted under Luther or may have had some affinity to Luther. And on the far end of that spectrum is Butzer. Butzer, you'll remember, was there at the Heidelberg Disputation. He sat in the audience. He was a Dominican. He really had many of the same experiences that Luther did. Issues of penance, the penitential cycle, purgatory, these kinds of things. Well, guys like Butzer remain enormously loyal to Luther as the man who sparked the Reformation in them personally. Those who are more inclined, in other words, towards the Lutheran side often do not agree with Luther on a number of points, in particular his doctrine of the Lord's Supper. But they'll be more charitable towards Luther. They'll try to reach out to him. They'll send letters. When Luther is being obstinate towards the end of his life, they'll start to reach out to Melanchthon. Again, this is Butzer to a T. He works with Melanchthon, in fact, at one point on a joint confession where he's trying repeatedly, never succeeding, but trying to bring Reformed and Lutheran perspectives together. You might say that Butzer's entire life was spent trying to heal the rift after the fallout of Marburg. But Bullinger and the successors are having none of it. Because, as you'll remember, Zwingli was killed as a result of the Second War of Kappel. There on the battlefield, he was struck down, and the other Catholic cantons or Catholic regions reimposed for a brief period of time Catholicism on top of these cities. So this isn't just a war of words. These are real wounds. They lost their brother in the church. They lost their teacher, their pastor. He was killed on the battlefield. And not just that, but his body was desecrated, which I won't go into, and then it was burned. Now, Butzer is never successful again. In fact, by the end of his life, Strasbourg becomes increasingly Lutheran, such that this is the reason why he flees to Cambridge. He takes Cranmer up on his offer, due in large part to the fact that his attempt to bring Lutheran and Reformed perspectives together had actually failed. And we actually have a very interesting specimen of this type of problem, because there was a man named John Hooper. John Hooper was an Englishman, and he was very instrumental in the Anglican Reformation. And for a period of time, he actually traveled to the city of Zurich, where he sat at the feet of Bullinger, one of his favorite theologians, and they became lifelong friends. Here's the interesting thing, though. When Butzer goes back to England under the reign of Edward VI, and he attempts to help Cranmer advance the Reformation there, well, Hooper sends a number of letters back to Bullinger, which we still have, in which he says, "Don't worry, I'm going to try and take this Butzer guy out. He and his closet Lutheranism, he and his monkeying around with the doctrine of the sacraments, not sticking to the Zurich line." Now, Bullinger never responds. Hooper, in my mind's eye, kind of has his arm around an unwilling Bullinger, and he's talking trash about Butzer, and Bullinger just has a mortified look on his face, because if you ever get to know the character of Bullinger, he's really not one for a lot of interpersonal fighting. He's very, very charitable. But again, this is the microcosm. On the one side, the Zurichers, you might say, the Zurich connection, it's sometimes called in reference to England, those who are out there are pushing an anti-Lutheran line. And you can imagine, they're not just Zwinglian, they're not just Reformed in a manner of speaking, but they will brook no nonsense when it comes to allowing any of this Lutheran talk or any kind of language of accommodation to fit. Now, where does Calvin fit in all this? Believe it or not, Calvin fits in the middle. Calvin actually, for the entirety of his life, leans more towards the Butzer side of things, though he won't try to monkey around with the language of the presence of Christ in the sacraments like Butzer did. But Calvin is not Zwinglian. He actually has criticisms throughout his Institutes and throughout his other writings about the excesses to which the Zwinglian understanding of the sacraments essentially evacuates Christ and the work of the Spirit in just about every part of worship, not just the sacraments. Calvin wants to talk about the presence of Christ, but he wants to talk about the spiritual presence of Christ by the Holy Spirit. Don't worry, we'll get to all of this in the lectures on the theology of Calvin and Luther. But Calvin is in the middle. He is not a hardcore anti-Lutheran. In fact, one of the recent biographies of Calvin gets this just right. He shows how Calvin is the last Reformed person to be sending charitable books and letters back and forth to Wittenberg. Calvin writes a little something, he sends it on to Wittenberg with a kind of, "Hey guys, what do you think of this?" tone to his letter. And it's just crickets. They don't write back, they don't respond. The frosty relationship is ongoing. And Calvin just keeps it up. "Hey guys, what do you think about this?" He just keeps reaching out and responding to them. Now, Calvin can be a bit waspy whenever he wants to be, whenever he differs with somebody. And he will differ, for example, with Melanchthon. But Calvin is on the Butzerian side of the equation. And that is because, as we'll see in a later lecture, Butzer is the first man to really, in a brotherly way, disciple Calvin when he was at his lowest. And something about Butzer really rubbed off on Calvin, I think. And besides, Calvin comes onto the scene 5 to 7 years after all of the spillout of Marburg. It's not part of his intuitive existential experience of the Reformation. He doesn't feel any angst about this. And like Butzer, Calvin works to attempt to bridge some of this while also, more importantly, attempting to galvanize all of the disparate shadings within the early Reformed Church between Zurich, Strasbourg, and Geneva. And so Calvin isn't coming to a blank slate. He's coming to a context that is actually rich with interpretation. All these little political intrigues, these little fights, and it's to their credit that Bullinger and Butzer welcome Calvin with open arms, and they shepherd him, in a manner of speaking, to being his own man while also embracing them as brothers. And Calvin will attempt, repeatedly in his Institutes, to deal with the ongoing tension, theologically as well as sociologically, between the Lutheran German side and the increasingly international Reformed movement that had spilled out from the Swiss Alps into a number of different countries like Scotland, England, the Netherlands, and France. And so in the end, Calvin is a man in the middle. He is actually more irenic, more charitable than just about everyone probably naturally or intuitively would assume. We're used to the plucky little individualist. But Calvin wants to be a man who is pro-Luther, though he doesn't swallow Luther's doctrines whole.